it's interesting because this week has been pretty special for me, mainly because there was an opening at the Whitney Museum of Gordon Motta Clark retrospective. And of course, Gordon was a dear friend of mine, and I worked with him on several projects. For instance, I worked with him on cutting apart the pier, the Gansevoort Street Pier over here in New York City, which doesn't exist anymore. It's, the name of the project was Day's End, and I also worked with him on the conical intersect in Paris. And what else did oh yeah, and then I went around with him several times to go when he was doing underground dailies, underground explorations. A lot of times Gordon needed a sidekick or someone to hang out with. And so he would call me up and we'd go do something. Like once we went down to where they were digging the new water supply tunnel for New York City. It was essentially 600 feet underground, and unbelievable. It was on the Harlem River side of the where the George Washington Bridge is, which is about 145th Street. And it was a beautiful August day, and we got into this huge elevator with all these people that do the digging. They're called sand hogs. And a beautiful sunny August day, we got in this elevator with about 40 guys and started dropping down this shaft, 600 feet down. I mean, if you can imagine, with water like coming down through the shaft, and this is like a caged elevator, and there's all these guys, they're really tough guys with like, construction helmets and this and that, and they're making jokes, and we're going down this hole. And we come down, the elevator, like all of a sudden opens into this like a central chamber, which was kind of like the staging area. And it was kind of like, the only thing I could think of is Fritz Lang's Metropolis. It had like all this kind of really surreal, like we come dropping down, and then all of a sudden it opens up, and it's like, I don't know, maybe it was like 40-foot kind of dome, blasted out of solid granite, and it had pumps, pumping, to pump air and pump water. And it had railroad tracks, and there were two tunnels. One was 2 miles in one direction, one was 1 mile in the other. And, like strings of lights, and it was wild. I mean, it was kind of, we went on this kind of operation where we went to the end of the tunnel with these guys. Basically what they were doing was they were drilling like a 60-foot diameter, 60? No, it wasn't 60, it was 20-foot diameter. 20 foot, 10, 12, ceilings, yeah, something like that, 18 to 20-foot diameter circle. They drill holes, put dynamite in, go up, blast, go back down, and then there would be a bunch of rock, and then they dig the rock, throw it into the carts and take it up to the elevator and take it out, right? I mean, that's the way they were digging tunnels. Now they have these kind of things like the tunnel, which is, the tunnel was built, like these kind of machines that are, they're driller borer machines that they assemble and just go through the rock. But at that point, which was 1970, I guess it was 77, 76, 77, someplace around there, they were just drilling and blasting. That's what they were doing. We were underneath the tunnel. Gordon was shooting film. It was me, Gordon, and his widow now, Jane Crawford. Went along on this kind of little sojourn, which was unbelievable. We were going underneath. We went out to the end. It was called a scaling operation, because what they do is they basically go to the end of the tunnel. They take these kind of ice pick chopper things, on poles, and they scrape the sides of the walls. So there's any loose rock, they knock it off, right? That's kind of what they're doing. And then we're going along with these guys, and they're sort of, they're making jokes. Like one guy was like a Czechoslovakian guy or something that had worked in the, if you could imagine, he was working in the uranium mines. I mean, it's like, they're just like, and they're walking along and they're going, you're going where no man has gone before, which is true because they had to dig the tunnel out. And then they would point up every once in a while they point up and they say, "You see that up there?" And I mean, obviously there's nothing there, just rock, you know. They say, "That's Van Cortlandt Park."
Hello.
Hello. And my lovely wife, Joyce Castleberry. This is Heinrich.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm being interviewed.
Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Okay. Anyway, so that was kind of one of the things. Now, this opening at the Whitney Museum is kind of interesting because essentially a lot of what Gordon did is, it's not, I mean, he's known for cutting apart buildings, which are essentially these, they're kind of challenges or deconstructions or, I mean, he was basically challenging the whole notion of architecture, but his whole deal was kind of, let me see if I could put it in some way that makes sense. I mean, Richard Nonis said something which is interesting. He said that we were all anarchists, which essentially meant that in the 70s it was kind of like this notion that society had failed and that we had to kind of then build or create our own utopias. It was a very utopian moment. Gordon was very involved in community, so essentially he was one of the guys who started or believed in the kind of community of Soho, which was much, much different. I mean, everybody kind of knew that in terms of the art market that there was no way that you were ever going to make any money. There was only 3 galleries in New York that were showing experimental art. And so everybody figured, now you're never going to make any money. Or, you know, everybody's kind of like on their own. There was always kind of experimental ways of, there wasn't a position about making objects to be plugged into the market. It was like, you know, the least notion. Indeed, Gordon, who was, you know, kind of art world royalty is what you would call it because his father was Mata, knew the way the game was played because he grew up with it. You know, he studied architecture, you know, essentially, but decided that he wanted to take more of a kind of a radical, assertive position. And so he had 2 things. One was kind of the artist community with all these kind of experiments, social experiments and that occurred. And the other thing was a kind of a radical gesture against architecture, or he called it anarchitecture, like, which was really kind of more about this notion of opening up. I don't know how to describe it, but Gordon liked to bring sunlight and open up air and kind of bring volume. He carved space, so it would make it more sculptural, rather than the notion of architects which are about building little walls and containing spaces and this and that kind of thing, which is essentially fairly boring. A lot of like what happened with Gordon is that he, by the nature of the very projects that he did, they were team projects, and so a lot of the people in the community would work on his projects. You know, he'd basically just get a bunch of artists and say, hey, anybody want to make some money? You know, I need to do this. And he'd just invite people. People would go and work, you know. They do stuff. Because everybody was poor. Nobody had any money. You know, it's like, you know, it's the notion, even the idea of a career was like, you know, people said career, what, in the art world? I mean, what does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. I mean, now, you know, it's like hypermarket and hyper, you know, art fairs and this and that, and everybody's like, comes out of art school with like, oh, I'm going to have a career as an artist. I mean, it's absurd, you know. I mean, it's kind of, what does that mean? You know, it's kind of, but anyway, a lot of what's interesting, which is not like Gordon, to play the market thing, because he did have a dealer and he was aware of it, so he would do drawings and this and that, which were kind of objects, and then he would cut apart buildings and he would save the chunks of the buildings, which were actually kind of funny, like, you know, saving chunks of buildings to make sculpture. You know, it's kind of, it's amusing, it's kind of funny. You know, it's very close to the notion of like Duchampian shift of objet tout or something like that. You know, it's kind of, or Daniel Sperry, or, you know, early kind of Christo with the wrapped storefronts and getting chunks of that. You know, that's all kind of within Nouveau Realist. I think it's Nouveau Realist, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, so Gordon was aware of that kind of stuff, and he also, what he did was interesting was that he had a really nice, like a Hasselblad camera, and he knew that everybody was doing conceptual earth art, which is what he aspired to or felt like he was part of, you know, with Smithson and what's his name, the guy who did Michael Heiser, and you know, all these guys are kind of, they were actually, in my opinion, they were kind of like, that was the end of the modernist discourse, and Gordon kind of like jumps over into the postmodernist kind of discourse, which actually really started in the 80s, I mean the 70s rather, postmodernism. And Gordon was kind of like in that area. But Gordon was aware of documentation as a method for dealing with conceptual work, so that's what he did a lot of. You know, and he had a really good Hasselblad camera, which he documented a lot of the cut pieces. As he got more into it, what's interesting is that he began to like actually cut the film and montage that, and then he started working with a kid. He set up his own darkroom to do his own Cibachrome prints, because everybody was doing Cibichromes, and that was kind of like the standard. I mean, that's what John Gibson was doing, and that's what people were selling, the Cibachrome prints for documentation. I mean, essentially, I think Laurie Anderson and Bill Beckley and a few other people who had come out of 112 Green Street were showing with Gibson and doing these kind of very glossy Cibichromes, which has become the kind of C-print and Cibachrome are kind of like the replacement for painting. But in any case, Gordon's a little bit more smarter than that, because he started looking at the notion of filmic space, and what happened within Gordon's cut pieces, the buildings, was this incredible kind of spatial disorientation, disorganization. I mean, it's kind of, it's visceral. You can't talk about it. The photographs don't quite do justice to it. I mean, the sensations they were not object sensations. They were sculptural sensations. There was something else occurring, which you know, it's kind of sad, like to understand that people are only getting part of the story. You know, they don't understand the notion of community, because community has been fractured apart. You know, and the kind of the discourse, if you talk about Marx's discourse, the notion is always that capitalism is alienating, and you're getting alienated from your production, the means of production, the tools, and then essentially you keep on getting alienated until you wind up in a point of alienation from each other, so that you're isolated. There's no community. So the opposite of that was what Gordon was trying to do, very specifically, was to create a community. And that was done in different ways, you know, starting food restaurant, you know, having large communities of performance art and this and that was occurring all around that time, which doesn't exist now. I mean, it's basically everybody's kind of got this situation where they turn themselves into a commodity, and then they kind of try to plug that into the market, except in the internet and new media, which started in the 90s, and that was, I would say that kind of virtual community is the kind of inheritor of a lot of the experimental energy of the 70s. At least that's, in my opinion, that's what that's about.